Good morning, everyone. For those of you that haven't been here before, this happens over about an hour, and what we try and do is have 30 minutes of conversation. That doesn't mean that you can't chip in and, participate, but 30 minutes of conversation with the two people on the couch, and after that we kind of open it to questions from everybody in the room to get some, and so that we have a very balanced view of both kind of Inyathelo side of things and what's really going on in each of your organizations, to get some kind of sense, of course, of what monitoring and evaluation resources and what kind of monitoring and evaluation frameworks and programs are actually in operation in each of your organizations. So, without any further ado, I think we're going to ask the most basic of all questions, and that is to say and ask Gaby and Alex to give us a definition of monitoring and evaluation. What does it mean to monitor? What does it mean to evaluate? Why do we do it? And how do we do it? And are those things, because often I think what happens, we talk about monitoring and evaluation like it's one thing, and it's not. There really are two things. They're monitoring and evaluation for a reason. So, firstly, Gaby, you are being a monitor.
Class monitor. Monitoring really is the kind of process that anyone follows to measure and keep track of whether we are achieving the output, certainly, that we have set to achieve. And I suppose in an organization, one of the most fundamental ways of monitoring an organization's activities is around finance. It's one of the most basic systems in play. I would imagine that every organization at least has its financial tracking in place. I think there are far fewer of us who have tracking of the rest of our organizational operations or the work that we do. So monitoring is the system of measuring and keeping track on, keeping an eye on whether we are doing the things we said we were going to do.
I have a follow-up question to that. What kind of course I do, how consistent does one have to be about gathering that kind of information? Is it something that you do once off? Is that something that you do as embedded in part of your program? Are there timelines for it?
It's a very good question, Gillian. There are different kinds of monitoring. So at the most basic HR level, there would be performance monitoring. And for those of us who do have relatively established kind of HR or internal management systems, most of us as staff members would be monitored and measured on how we're doing in terms of our performance. And you may have in place some kind of performance agreement with your manager or with the organization generally. In the same way, you would have some kinds of contractual agreements with donors around the outputs and the activities that you've said you were going to do. And you would have committed or contracted to spending the grant in particular ways. So monitoring and measuring those kinds of things, I say monitoring and measuring, I'm sort of using them slightly interchangeably. Measuring the extent to which you are doing what you are contracted to do, either as a staff member and you're being performance monitored, or with your donor and your output or grant expenditures being monitored. Those are systems that need to be put in place and implemented as organizational frameworks, as ways of operating. Most of the systems that we use internally at Inyathelo are kind of basic tracking systems. Our output monitoring is around measuring. If we said we were going to do 8 workshops this year, have we done that? If we said we wanted to interact with 300 individuals from the nonprofit sector, have we done that? The evaluation of that is a different thing. But to answer your question about what kinds of systems there should be in place and how often that would be done, it really does depend on what it is that you're monitoring. For example, performance, which is more HR than program-based, although they're obviously integrally linked because your entire organizational system feeds into the delivery of your contracted or donor-funded programs. That your performance would be measured kind of formally maybe twice or intermittently 4 times a year. but maybe on a weekly basis you might meet with your line manager to discuss your progress and your delivery. So it feels, in a sense, like monitoring is a system of gathering data, collecting. So you would obviously know what you wanted to collect, and kind of feeding it towards a funnel to be able to answer very particular questions. Have we done what we said we were going to do? Have you as a staff member done what we agreed you were going to do, etc.?
Thank you. Alex, having gathered all the data and having put these kinds of systems in place, and now we have information in an organization or in a program or in a project, the evaluation part entails what exactly?
Someone once said a very useful thing to define what monitoring and evaluation was, or the difference to me, which was monitoring is about asking the question, are we doing things right? And evaluation is about asking, are we doing the right things? And the word evaluation sort of indicates what evaluation is, which is about making a value judgment on something. And so the purpose of an evaluation is never to, a lot of people interpret it as almost an interrogation, are you doing a good job at something? But it's really, there's inquiry is at the heart of evaluation. And so only put time, money, resource, and effort into an evaluation if you're asking a critical question about your work. We do evaluations in our own lives on a daily basis. We just do a lot of it in our heads. We're often making value judgments at certain critical points. Is after a year, am I happy in this job? Let me look at all the evidence that my head has collected in that year, and then if I'm going to now do an evaluation of whether I should stay in this job, I'm going to do an analysis essentially and then make a decision from that. So if one relates that sort of approach to a project, one could say that doing an evaluation feeds very much into organizational strategy, where once you've come up with the answer to whatever your evaluation question was, that should really determine whether you carry on with the particular program or project approach you're taking, or if you should switch direction. Could I give an example of a project that did that? There was a youth leadership program that was working in the Western Cape, and a school asked them to come in and do a leadership workshop for the day with a group of girls. And they had a fairly standard workshop approach and a bunch of exercises planned. When they got there, halfway through the day, one of the girls said, there's no point in you doing any of this stuff with us because we don't believe in ourselves. Everyone around us tells us we're rubbish. Our teachers say we're underperforming. Our parents are always critical. So how must I be a leader? And it's a snapshot, but in that one day, they switched their program, and instead of doing leadership training per se, they simply worked on self-validation and self-esteem. And that for them was the most useful direction switch for their program, because without that, you can't have leaders. And so they then changed their entire program based on that quick snapshot evaluation of what they should do next. I haven't got a silver bullet answer for how much time any organization should spend on M&E. I think it's around the capacity that you have. If you don't have the resources to hire someone specifically to do monitoring and evaluation, then it's going to fall down to potentially the program or the project staff to build that into the work that they're doing. That then begs the question, how much do you then ask people to do? So there's the gold standard of having, a log frame for every project, a monitoring and evaluation plan for every project, which is a lot around what data you're collecting, who collects it, and at what point it's collected, and theories of change documented, policies written out on your M&E approach, and so on and so on. That stuff's just not feasible in its entirety for people who are doing this as part of their job. So I'd say work out what your own capacity is and adapt around that, and work also within the knowledge that if you're strapped for time, then you're not going to do something like a randomized control trial to gather your data, because you're going to have to find 60 people who match the 60 beneficiaries and do a post and pre-comparison, and that's just going to take a lot of time. You might also not have the time to do surveys on a 6-monthly basis and then analyze and gather all the data. So there are a bunch of methodologies that you can also use which are quicker. You might do a focus group, so gather 30 people together and interview them within a group context and then draw conclusions from that. Or you might get one of your staff members to go and sit and just observe for a pure week your project in a very objective way and come back and draw out those findings. So rely also on different techniques, field trips, visits, any way that you can gather data. The internal-external question, I'm quite an advocate for gathering monitoring data internally. I think it's quite easy to do. It should actually really be part of the job, and to put it on paper or have some record of the data that you're needing to collect. Because if you quit your job or you leave or you get headhunted, the next person who comes into your role, who's then tasked with managing an evaluation 2 months later, suddenly has no data to give to the person who's doing the evaluation. And then your evaluation is not going to be complete or very in-depth. When it comes to evaluation, I personally, and this is just an opinion, I don't know what you think, Gaby, advocate for someone external doing your evaluation, simply because I just think we all have an inherent bias to want to say what we're doing is brilliant, and that's normal and understandable. And actually a lot of the time what we are doing is brilliant, but it blinds us a bit to the unintended effects of what we're doing, because in all of our lives we have a positive, a negative, a positive effect and an unintended negative effect. So just by existing, I might benefit my family, but I harm the environment, because it seems to me that every human on the planet has some kind of does some kind of damage without realizing. So an external person will give that independence. One quick example to validate that is there's a report that's been recently released called Platinum and Passes, and it's a very in-depth but very nicely written evaluation of Anglo's 100 million rand spent over 5 years in education in the Limpopo region and I'm going to get it wrong, one other place. And Anglo paid for the evaluation, but they got other people to do it, and that was wise, and I admire them for that, because the findings were very unfavorable. Essentially, it came down to you spread yourselves too thinly, didn't really do the right interventions, and so your 100 million rand didn't lead to improved learning outcomes. That's quite a massive thing to put into the public, but it wasn't just Anglo's fault, because the evaluation had been done so well, and they'd really interrogated why this had come about, and it turned out there were a bunch of other variables that were outside of Anglo's control, which can then guide the way education interventions in that region are done going forward. So just to wrap up, hiring someone is costly, and I have seen some evaluations done by PhD students or master students or students from the Graduate School of Business who are then, they're doing your evaluation as a project. I like that sort of free resource approach very much. The only thing is sometimes the person doing your evaluation is not going to be an expert in the subject matter that you work with. So I, for example, have quite a lot of experience in education evaluation, but I wouldn't put myself near a health project, because I would waste half the time trying to understand what their intervention was and then evaluate it, and my evaluation is just not going to be as good. So be careful who you choose and their level of expertise in the subject that you're working in.
My name is Emily. I'm from an organization called Yabonga. Thank you very much for this. I was interested in, well, I agree with Alex that monitoring should be part of the integral work that you're doing anyways, but the evaluation, is it our responsibilities as NGOs to ask the funder for part of the budget to do a professional evaluation?
Yeah, my approach or my recommendation would be that for each project there is an evaluation component. Not that you would necessarily have to do a full evaluation of every project. That would depend on if the donor wants that. And if they do want it, then they do need to pay for it. But there are also ways of being able to combine pieces of evaluation budget across various projects and then use that combined budget to do a fuller evaluation, which is often more useful, because individual projects may achieve one part of an objective or goal, but combined, it's kind of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So yeah, I strongly believe that we need to ask for the funding. We need to be upfront about it. If the donor insists on an evaluation, then they need to be they need to pay for it. It is expensive work. Yeah.
It's not about the donor, as Carol said. It's actually about measuring your real impact. So it shouldn't be about what the donor expects, but what you are achieving.
Yeah, which goes back to my one of my earlier points about we do want to know whether we are achieving the impact we want to. But to be able to fund that requires usually quite substantial budget. So, yeah, I mean, donors, it's a very valid budget item for donors to cover because they also want to know what your impact is.
Just from years of dealing with donors and running organizations which are completely donor funded and having to ask those things, I think donors are really very much open to it, but to paying for those things, and maybe not even for the entire part of it, but for parts of it. The thing, though, is I think that more and more what we have to realize is that it's a really integral part of what our operation is about. As much as you need telephones, or you need project officers, or you need desks and a roof over your head in order to be able to do a project or have your organization exist, monitoring and evaluation is as important as those things, and therefore in ways when you set out your budget, and I know there's been a discussion around budgets, when you set out your budget, I think it's an entirely legitimate cost of doing business for a non-profit. And the outcomes and what you are actually presenting as a result of having some kind of monitoring and evaluative process is that you're telling your donor how you are best able to do your job better and how you are going to use their resources more efficiently and more effectively. And most donors, I think, really do understand that. You might have to explain it in a little bit, unpack it a bit in a budget, but I think they understand that completely.
I'd just be interested to hear whether or not, you mentioned focus groups, and whether or not you think that there is a value in including more quality. We clearly, nonprofits could do quantitative evaluation better. My question is whether or not you think we can do qualitative evaluations better as well.
I very much agree with you that for me, the M&E, a lot of why it feels so heavy and dry and is because it is donor-driven. And I think we've noticed an intensity of pressure to produce M&E in the last 5 years, and quite specifically since the economic situation happened in 2008. There's less money, and it's been given in more specific ways, and so there's almost a competitive culture even within M&E. Who can prove your impact better? The more likely you are to get donor money, because they're under pressure to prove that spend is being spent best because there's less money. So the rules of the M&E game are set by donors, and they are set by donors because of money, and money dictates. We do a lot of the work we do because we're funded. What I'm yet to see, though, is non-profits and actually anyone coming together to start a conversation with donors around a new way to do M&E, or how to do things differently, or what our needs are, because donors are not monsters. They just think in a particular way, have offered us fairly dry language, words like theory of change and indicator, output, outcome. They don't inspire one. But I also haven't heard any nonprofit say, well, this is the way we're going to language it. Is that okay? This is the way we're going to report. This is the way we're going to do our evaluation findings. Your question around can we do qualitative evaluation better, I 100% agree with you. I think we can. I think that a lot of the time we set our standards too low, and we almost turn our thinking off when we do reports for donors. So we put in all the numbers and we write a few sentences because we're a bit nervous that they won't give us funding again, so we don't want to write something that has quite a bit of oomph to it. And we're also a bit shy, and I think South Africans specifically don't always put their opinion to paper. I want to see, what nonprofits know inherently as they're going through their work is gold, but very little of that actually appears in donor reports. So even if it involves you starting to put in 5 paragraphs with every report that you send in, key observations and key learnings that you've gathered through whatever your qualitative evaluation methods are, start doing that and chats with your donors to see if that's something that they're interested in. Certainly, one of our teams at Inyathelo, who run the Ask Inyathelo clinic, they meet regularly to discuss key trends, things that they're noticing in their work, and that feeds a lot of information that our donors want to know, which is beyond just the number of nonprofits who came into our clinic, but they want the wisdom of our staff who collectively debate this stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. Some more questions?
Can I just... thank you. I think one of the... it feels like a massive vacuum is that we all write these evaluation reports and we report to donors kind of giving all these numbers and hopefully a little bit of effect and outcome. And I always wonder where it goes. What do the donors do with it? Because they must get thousands of these things. Do they actually take them on board? Do they look at how their funding programs may need to shift or change because of it? This speaks to what Alex has just said about we have so much knowledge in the nonprofit sector about what does and doesn't work. And I don't know to what extent we're sharing it with each other. I don't get a sense that we do sufficiently, and I think that one of the big obstacles to sharing is that we don't talk about failure very well. It's not something we particularly, it's not a platform we like to stand on, because donors may say, well, we won't be funding you anymore. So yeah, it feels like quite a, it feels like something that we should maybe be looking to change or to sort of have more conversations around is actually learning, sharing with each other. We know all about the successful programs, but I reckon quite a few of us are having programs that maybe don't work so well, but we can spin it and it looks very nice for the donor. I'm just suggesting. I'm not really.
Oh, thank heavens, you're only suggesting.
My question is if you have any strategies for collecting longitudinal data. We work with learners, so obviously getting that kind of information would be helpful for evaluation in the future, and I'm just wondering if you all have done that, what strategies there are.
I'm passionate about longitudinal data, and I think it's just the most awesome thing to be able to find out how a program or a person is doing at points over a 5-year period. And some of the projects that have done that successfully have been absolutely unbelievable. The problem is, and I know SAP work with young people, what I've seen is that young people change their email addresses and phone numbers all the time, and it's difficult to locate them, and they're like slippery fish. They're always doing new things, and they're trying stuff, and it's, as much as you might want to monitor the impact of your program in 3 years' time on them, there actually are some quite logistical barriers to that, which I'm yet to see a program successfully overcome. I'm seeing a lot of people ask the question, but I don't know what the answer is. I do know that incentivization to respond is one thing that eConva Youth and Activate both used in their evaluations, where they gave 10 Rand, I think, of airtime for students to fill out a survey. And in another evaluation, some other incentive was offered. That also created an issue of fake data because people wanted 30 Rand of airtime data, so some fake names were created. And you come across interesting creative approaches, but if you know, for example, that your learners are going into a specific study institution and you're collecting longitudinal data over 5 years, the people who don't respond or drop off after 5 years, you could also safely assume are no longer successful in your intervention or have dropped out because they failed or because they made a different choice. And so you can draw some kind of judgment even from the data that you don't get, because generally people, if I'm asked about something on a survey that I haven't done well at, there's a likelihood I may not reply to your survey, and you may be then able to draw the conclusion that your intervention didn't work with me, and I'm a bit ashamed to say it. But yeah, it's an interesting question, and certainly much easier to collect longitudinal data on things like the environment and object change, essentially.
Thank you very much for being here. Please, the discussion and the conversation is not over.